Hello, this is the discussion for World Lit Roebuck Period 1. Today we'll be talking about Nepal, England, Ireland, and China with Matthew, Michael, and Hogan, and Cody. We're going to be doing a wide range of discussions, so sit back, take a drink, take a snack, enjoy.
Yes.
That was like an NPR.
That was good. I like that. You could be
I'm your host, Cody Monroe.
Michael, do you want to go ahead? Michael, do you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. So let's just start with music. Did you guys how many of you guys did music?
Music, yep.
I did music for Ireland, yeah.
Okay, cool. So a bunch of us did music. So what would you say the music's role is? In your country?
So I think definitely coming from an Irish perspective, music is something that has definitely been impactful, not just in a traditional sense of old world and people kind of when instruments were first starting being developed back in ancient times, but
right.
There's definitely been recently in Ireland there's been that resurgence of traditional music, and it's being called trad music now, and you'll see it being played a lot more in pubs and just at parties in Ireland all over the country.
So it's kind of like throwback stuff.
Yeah, and actually there's a lot of modern groups that are performing this style of Irish music that everybody recognizes as Irish music, with a lot of fiddle and drums.
And the mandolin a little bit? Maybe.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, yeah. No, I've got a buddy who plays mandolin, and he looks up all these old songs, and it's just kind of fun. It's a kind of a fun, the spirit of the songs that I've heard anyways they're fun and kind of goofy, but they're totally something you could see everyone singing along to at a party or something. And
so actually, as for one of my sources, I looked at a segment of a radio show by Rick Steves, who is founder of Rick Steves Europe, a travel agency that works to create guidebooks and help people travel in Europe better. And one of the episodes of his radio show was all about Ireland and primarily Irish music. And one of the guides on there talked about how anything about Irish music is about love, depression, unrequited love, or misery, and just a lot of his music. Their music is very emotional in the sense. It's not really happy music, but
right.
The sound of it can be really uplifting. A song that I looked at for one of the sources is called "Whiskey in the Jar" by the High Kings.
Yeah, we listened to that.
Yeah, we listened to that here earlier, and it's a really upbeat sounding song. It's super peppy, nice, shiny major key, but the actual song is about a man who goes out and steals money from a friend of his, kills him, and then his wife turns him into the authorities. So it's the music there. It's really part of a national culture of kind of that storytelling.
Right. So you primarily looked at Ireland in the present more than anything?
Yeah.
Or okay, gotcha. So would you say that now Ireland's kind of mood would be that same sort of maybe happy on the outside but kind of troubled on the inside, or do you think that's just because it's the resurgence of that older music that used to tell the story of Ireland?
I think it's always kind of been there. It's definitely existed in the past, but now in that resurgence, people are recognizing this old form of telling stories through song and dancing.
Right. So it's just the mode. So you would say that maybe there are some underlying problems with Ireland.
Possibly.
Okay, gotcha.
Well, I think there's underlying problems with all of our countries. If you look at the past of our countries, like England, Ireland, Nepal, and China, they're always involved in something, and there's political infighting and there's manipulation, and even if you look at the music in England and other Germanic countries during the 1800s and earlier, there's so much just fighting even between the composers. If you look at Mozart's time, and I know that's in Germany and that's kind of straying from our countries,
Austria.
Austria.
Same thing.
Yeah, sure. In those countries, they all wanted the same stuff, and they hated each other, but they never actually took any physical violence for the most part. So, they're all kind of bad, and I haven't done that much research in Nepal. I just know they're touristy, but
Nepal's kind of interesting story because it's kind of always been a battle between because it's right between India and China. So they both want control of it. So a lot of their songs, like, or like their big like music's like. So the thing with Nepal is India's biggest trading partner. Most of its music come from India, but however they do have a couple like most of their songs are like old like folklore and kind of newer music's kind of a blend between Hindu and Buddhist. So kind of that Indian and Chinese culture merging.
Nice.
But yeah, I mean it's kind of even to this day. They had a revolution in 2010 for power. It's kind of interesting.
But right, well, to your point, Cody, England and Ireland have definitely taken violent. I mean, even in the 20th century, you had the Irish, is it the Republic Army?
Yeah, well, still today they're up in like the towns that are kind of bordering Northern Ireland and then the Republic. There's still a lot of fighting and disagreement between the Catholic Irish and the Protestant English.
Right. So I mean, it's been violent for pretty much as long as they've been there. You know, it's kind of been the English imperialists, and you saw that a lot in like the 1800s, even back to the 1600s. You know, England has always been a very imperialist kind of let's go control what we want, and you start to see that diminish towards the beginning of the 20th century there. They lose the World War. Well, almost. They get destroyed by it, right? So they win in, I guess, classical sense. Right. But, I mean, in the First World War, they lost almost an entire generation of young men. I mean, they were all, like, 18 to 25-year-old guys, right? And if they did survive, they came back with just horrible stories, horrible images in their head, and injuries, too, right? And so then you see in World War II, they just get annihilated, right? They get, bombed, day and night. They get destroyed, and even though they do end up winning, it takes 6 years, essentially, to get out of that war. And so afterwards, you kind of see Ireland get the idea of, ooh, we kind of still don't want to be associated with you, and if you come over here, and so, like, you see the IRA forming. And they are still active today. They'll still do
and so
crazy stuff.
That was a very nice transition from music to war, and China has a lot of experience with war. In fact, they wrote one of the most a guy named Sun Tzu,
The Art of War,
wrote one of the most famous tactical manuals
ever. They still read that in ROTC.
Yeah, they still read it in ROTC. It's still used. Of course, it's an English translation. They don't expect the ROTC kids to read Chinese. That'd be
cool, though.
Be awesome.
Yeah,
but,
read this book in Chinese.
Yeah, so the Art of War.
But it's one of the greatest tactical manuals, and people wrote spin-offs, and almost all of the winning strategies from that point onward have had something to do, usually, if that person has read it, it's got something to do with one of those strategies. There can be a base back to it, and I was wondering if there was any textbooks or other things that you guys have looked at that have a very similar effect to your country. Maybe not on the war topic, but is there some other piece of influential work that just everybody looks at?
So in Ireland, it's not necessarily war based. It's definitely religious based. So a little bit of history lesson. After the Roman Empire fell in the West. So after the Roman Empire fell in the West, barbarians from the north kind of came down and kind of ravaged everything and kind of broke up what was then just really small independent countries that basically just owned their own hilltop, and that was it. But in Ireland, because it was so far away and the Romans never got there, a lot of monks and scholars fled to Ireland. And then that age became known as the Age of Saints and Scholars. And because the Roman Empire had never had influence there, they were free from control or people trying to take over the Roman Empire again. They were free to kind of sit there and figure out stuff and preserve Western thought and philosophy. And one of the biggest pieces of literature, similar culturally to the Art of War in China, but in Ireland, it's the Book of Kells, which is the oldest manuscripted copy of the New Testament.
Yep.
And it's locked inside a box, inside another room, inside a museum, and no cameras are allowed in it, in the exhibit to see it. And it's definitely one of those things that has impacted that country a lot, just because of that tie back to how Ireland really preserved that Western philosophy.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, like, culturally what would be comparable to that. Like, I was thinking earlier music, like, you've got, obviously, some of the early composers, but most of those guys that people would recognize were from Germany or from Austria or countries around there. I'm even looking at a list. Right, so Shakespeare's not a composer, and I'm getting there. Yeah, Handel was there. Thomas Tallis, William Byrd, Henry Purcell are a couple that, if you've taken Western Civ, you would kind of recognize. But nothing, we wouldn't be able to name any pieces from them, probably, unless you're kind of versed in it. Right?
I mean, Handel's Messiah is one that everyone...
One of the greatest musical works of all time, but...
Right, so that's one thing, though. You guys have entire books and stuff, and that's what I'm talking about. So, like, and then if you still go into music, it's like, you got, like, the, you know, the British invasion in, like, the 70s and 80s, even the 60s of rock and roll kind of taking root kind of in America from, like, the beatnik movement and stuff. And you had kind of, like, the blues and stuff developing in America. But you really had, like, classic rock starting in England and coming over here, and that was one of their biggest exports. Because, again, after all of that imperialist control had kind of diminished, right, so all these countries are taking independence for themselves, they're declaring to be their own nations and stuff, so England's got lots of connections, but they don't really have a whole lot of control, maybe influence, but not, you know, stone cold iron fist, we are your, you know, masters, right, and so that's one thing that you, and that's one thing that you kind of see music driving them towards, but like Matt was saying earlier, like Shakespeare would be, I probably would say, the most well-known writer from England, and I mean, it's still, we read it in high schools across pretty much everywhere today, and multiple of his works, right, so you read Romeo and Juliet, you read Macbeth, Midsummer's Night Dream, all kinds of stuff, right, and there's a bunch. So regardless of the whole, like, he didn't write it or he, you know, took it from someone, it's still relevant today in a big way. So I'd say that's probably England's contribution.
I mean, the closest thing for an apologist, because unfortunately for the longest time it's kind of been a fight of a public state between India and China to keep that border secure.
Right.
So there isn't really any, like, major works like come out of Nepal. I guess the biggest thing would be, like, climbing in Everest.
Gotcha.
Well, that could go with the art of tourism too. Like, I mean, it's not
it's
classical art, but like it's, as you said, most of the country's GDP for Nepal is their climbing, and like people come from all over just to climb Everest,
and that's well deserved for Nepal.
You're right.
It's fantastic mountains.
Right, they have great mountains. They have really good mountains, and like. They milk it for all it's worth, and that's great.
Well, it's a big place for religious scholars. Like right at the base of Everest, I forget what it's called. There's this really beautiful monastery there that's kind of like a rite of passage to go past, and you can visit it. And apparently, it's like one of the most beautiful places in the country because you get to see the South Col of Everest, followed by this beautiful monastery, this massive like high-altitude plain. It's also the highest monastery in the world at 17,000 feet.
Oof.
Wow. That's impressive.
Yeah.
That's several.
To think it only goes up from there. So, like, they have musics, but it's mostly chants in the monasteries, right?
Yeah, well, it's the whole Hindu, Buddhist kind of fusion music, like Newa, and there's a couple other different, like, versions of it. It's all like, folk tales. It's like one of the biggest well-known folk tales is a story called Don Chalada, which is, like, it's kind of an interesting story, but, like, there's this girl and her family's kind of struggling, and there's this goat that comes down to help them. It's a spirit in the Hindu culture that comes down to help her and like guides her to prevent her from getting eaten by these evil spirits.
So that's actually kind of a good spot to transition. It sounds like Nepal is very enthralled in religious culture.
Oh, yes.
And I would probably argue that lots of Eastern countries are that way. Maybe not China specifically, just because of the industrial kind of complex they've got right now.
Well,
and
not
the communist kind
currently,
of control.
But traditionally.
In the past, there was...
Absolutely, but I'm talking like now in 21st century. I know for a fact that in the United States, people will identify with a religion, but they won't necessarily keep to every specific aspect of it, or they're not super. Stop pointing. They're not super enthralled in it. Like they might not make every decision in their life based on that belief system, right? So and I would probably argue the same thing for Ireland. They probably all have the religion, but it's probably mostly be Catholic.
I mean, like for our countries, for England and Ireland, maybe not so much England, but for a lot of Europe, it's predominantly Catholic, and there are some. The younger generation definitely doesn't follow the same like strict guidelines or rules that they keep themselves as the older generation, but there definitely is still that presence of Catholicism in the rest of Europe, and then in England, it's mostly Protestant.
Right. Gotcha.
And that's because of another reason.
China is primarily Buddhist, and like Nepal, I would suspect is
81.3% Hindu.
Ooh,
that's surprising.
Interesting.
Actually,
well, I mean, India's right there.
Well, and most of their, like over 61% of their trade comes from India.
Right.
So while they've transitioned more to just their own country since 2010 in their referendums, but most of their trade comes from India, which makes sense why the country's mostly Buddhist. And actually, by these numbers,
Hindu.
Yeah, mostly Hindu.
Yeah, Hindu, and over 90% of people are religious, as compared to like this.
Well, and
70% I think it's in the U.S.
Yeah. Do you guys think that like technology and industrialization has an effect on the percentage of religious individuals, or like people who are ascribed to a religion and follow like daily practices?
I'd say it's more culture that kind of creates that rift between people and their beliefs, because if you look at even just worldwide, especially like in the Western world, you kind of see stuff happening at the beginning of the, I guess even the 20th century. You are all pretty much still based in a religious kind of society, and most people would identify with a religion, and it's a very family-centric ideology there. And then once you get about halfway through the century, you start seeing music and films and even just like cars and stuff starting to take more of a role. And I mean, as a proponent of most religions being the whole like don't have other gods besides yours, especially in monotheistic religions, you start to see, in a sense, that culture and living while you're young and being exciting and that kind of thing, and it just kind of gets more to a bigger degree, I guess, with the whole culture is the biggest part of our lives. And if you look now at the 21st century, it's pretty much everything. If you look at just even kids in around high school, it's almost entirely what are we doing this weekend and what's the new music and all this stuff and everything. Like, have you guys ever noticed people calling something old?
Yes.
Like, oh, that song is like ancient. It's from 2 years ago. Yeah, and so these religions that were established literally thousands of years ago, if not more, I wonder what they think of them, right? So their family might say, oh, well, this is what we are, even if they don't practice it, like we already discussed. So now they might just think that if I think a song that's 2 years old is ancient, something ancient is irrelevant to them at that point. So I would say that it's more the culture, and kind of the newer generation seems to always take it one step further, right? So you had rock and roll in the 50s, and then you had a little bit harder in the 60s, right? In the 70s, you started seeing hard rock and stuff, and AC/DC came out, right? In the 80s, you started seeing metal be a thing, and then you had Screamo in the 90s, and it just keeps going. And now we've got rap, which is basically all about sex and drugs and being in a gang, at least the majority that I've heard. And not all of it, but that seems to be the general tendency of it, right? Sure. It's not like even rock and roll talked about some of those same things, right? If you look at Motley Crue, Dr. Feelgood is about a guy who literally slung cocaine on the streets, paid off the cops, and got away with everything, right? But it was all through innuendos and masked language so that it's anyone could listen to it and say, oh, this is a good beat, blah, 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 all this stuff. Now it's totally uncensored. They curse and use the N-word like every other word, and somehow that's culturally acceptable, and that is the norm, right? Like all these kids in our high school listen to it.
Which is kind of surprising if not politically correct. Most of us are.
That is true.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty correct because like when you want to be correct.
Right. Well, we're not going to get into that discussion here. That's a time. That's a discussion.
That's next week's episode.
Yeah, next week's episode. Come back to the 4 guys in a room.
Sounds like a porno.
4 guys.
No,
that didn't. This is a school project, man.
You just made it real weird.
All right. So and like
someone spelled tourism wrong on the board.
Yeah, shut up.
Okay.
All right, so I think we have a good segue now. Like we talked a little bit about it earlier with the art of war
Yeah.
from China, but I kind of want to get into like physical literature that each country has, both ancient and modern.
Are you talking like
Frankenstein,
written
Mary
in
Shelley.
stone or what?
No, not written in stone, but like poetry, other books.
Oh,
that,
okay.
Not necessarily
Yeah,
religious based or like tactical based, like the Art of War or the Book of Kells.
Yeah.
But more just like stuff that just comes out in the bookshop.
Well, China is, with the amount of people that China has, even in ancient times, like now their population is stupidly big, but even in ancient times, there were a lot of people that didn't need to be doing farming or other things, so they had a lot of downtime to just sit and write and do math and like just lots and lots of stuff. And there were guys that like Confucius.
Yep.
I mean, that's all he did was sit, think, and write.
Same thing with the Greeks with Socrates. All he did was
Right.
just kind of walked around town and just like
have discussions.
Yeah, just have discussions
and think.
One of the biggest fallacies of the modern education system is the whole we're going to have a Socratic seminar.
Yeah.
The actual Socratic method was literally sitting around, maybe having some snacks, chatting with the boys. That's
Like
literally
we're
what the
doing
Socratic
here.
method is. Right. So, I mean, I got my coffee. We need some donuts or something. But
We're not cops.
So okay. Wow, broad brush, way to go. But like I had done like last year, we did like the Socratic discussion club. No one showed up because it's modern day high school. No one wants to have conversations.
I didn't even know there was a discussion club. That would have been awesome.
Well, yeah, I didn't have classes with you guys as often as I do this year. But we literally, it was just during lunchtime in Miss Lombardi's room, and we just kind of sat there and chatted. And it didn't work as well because it was all basically just the kids in my friend group, so we all do this anyways.
Right.
But it would have been really interesting to get even just people who I like and who I'm familiar with to get in there and just kind of have conversations. But what I really wanted it to be is a bunch of different people, right, from, you know, a lot of different aspects of life and, you know, thought processes, and kind of get in there and talk about it. But that didn't work out as well as I wanted it to.
maybe after this we can look at something that could work. Because I'd enjoyed that.
All right,
back to literature.
Since we're talking about stuff, we might as well talk about language. Like, I mean, you guys, England and Ireland share a common language. Well, sort of.
I mean,
sort of. They do now.
They do now, but traditionally a lot of Irish, and there still are places in Ireland called Gaeltachts that still speak Gaelic, which is the traditional language of Ireland.
That's epic.
It's super
hard to speak.
It's really hard to learn and speak. I've tried. It's insanely difficult. But these Gaeltachts in rural parts of Ireland, they're basically kind of like historic parks. Or like,
so they're like, here, the religious group, the
Amish?
That's the one.
not necessarily. No, they're just living like any other rural community would, like with cars and.
They just speak.
They just speak Gaelic predominantly.
That's lit.
Yeah, and I think
cool.
they're actually subsidized by the government because they're in such rural areas.
So it's kind of like the.
It's like a historic park.
It's like an
almost.
Indian reservation.
For Gaelic.
Pretty much, yeah.
Kind of.
And that happens in Nepal too, just because of how, like the mountain towns and how separated they are, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there are 19 different recognized languages.
19 different recognized
Nepal.
languages. That's
Yeah,
that's
so
a lot.
Because here's the thing with the country. It starts at about 3,000 feet of elevation and goes up to over 29.
That's insane.
Yeah.
So, like,
wow.
And it's not easy to get around because most of the mountains over there, like some of them get 8 of the 10. There are 8 mountains in Nepal that are over 8,000 feet, 8,000 meters,
Oof.
and just it's a high plain with cold weather and a lot of mountains, so it's really hard to get around. So things you just not travel very easily until the internet, which is how getting developed. So which is why there's still 19 different national languages,
Yeah.
and there's even more like dialects from village to village that aren't recognized. because of how isolated the different towns are.
Yeah.
There's not one town in Nepal. It's over 1 million people.
I mean, you sort of see that in China, just like between Mandarin and like other different Chinese languages. There's a bunch of written languages, and like there's just a bunch of stuff, there's just like so much. But it's just such a big country, and like it's not isolated per se. You can travel around inside China, but it's just big, and like right,
Yeah,
it's just big.
Well, it's just different too, because if you go like in the cities, you're not going to find very many poor people. But if you go out into the rural farmlands,
Yeah,
when all the wealth is centered around their cities,
Well,
it's kind of
in Ireland and England, or in
no,
Nepal?
in
Oh,
in
China.
Nepal
Yeah.
and China.
Well,
Nepal
in
and
China,
China.
the wealth is redistributed. So
Communism.
Oh.
I mean,
the gem of Southeast Asia and Russia. But
well,
same
yeah, North Korea maybe.
But North Korea's like a town that's not successful.
So
Like they want to be
A
China,
non-
but
Alright.
Non-successful
they're-
China. Okay.
we were talking about literature earlier. Would you guys say that the stuff that's written right now in your countries is like directly related to the events that are going on? Like, do you think they're comparable, or do you think they tell the story of the country?
I don't think so. I was looking around at different like poems and literature works that are being produced in Ireland right now, and kind of like how I said earlier about how there's a resurgence of traditional music, there's really a resurgence of just traditional culture in general. Like people are kind of embracing that identity of what it really means to be Irish. And it's like one of the poems that I read was called Raglan Road, and it's become a really famous song.
Read it to us.
I don't have it. Do you mind pulling it up on your?
Right.
What's it called?
Raglan Road. I forgot to put it on my paper.
So would you say that it's
But-
just like this kind of like forms of expressive art are more individualized than they are in other countries, or maybe were
I think so.
20
I
years
think
ago?
it's some of them are more individualized, but some of them are also like community based. Like it's something that a community might experience that they can express through music or writing.
But it's not totally applicable to the whole country or the whole world, or anything
Sometimes
like
it
that.
can be.
So
But
in
in the context of the actual poem or the work, you can tell that it's directly related to Ireland or the Irish people. But it does have that overtones that can be used in different countries. But I'll just read a little bit of that poem.
oh, yes.
So, on Raglan Road, on an autumn day, I saw her first and knew that her dark hair would weave a snare that I might one day rue. I saw the danger, yet I walked along the enchanted way, and I said, let grief be a falling leaf at the dawning of the day. So that's just the first two stanzas of the poem, and it goes on to talk about how this man, and it's written by Patrick. His last name's really hard to pronounce because it's Gaelic, but the author's first name is Patrick, and he's basically talking about, and I read the background of this poem. It's how he fell in love with a girl but they had an age separation that was just too much to ignore, but how he fell in love with her walking down this Raglan Road, which is an actual street in Dublin.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah, so but like he's talking about how like when he first saw her, he knew it was love at first sight, but then he says, I saw the danger, yet I walked along that enchanted way, and I said, let grief be a falling leaf. So it's kind of like saying like, oh, like this is really sad. I can't go on with her. I can't.
But he's gonna let it go at the dawning of the day, like
Yes.
the leaves falling. I like it.
Because and a lot of works in Ireland are like that, about how with loss and laments in music,
Right.
just kind of this deep emotion about these depressing things, or sometimes really happy things. But
And that's why they drink.
I mean that's also part of the culture. Is,
Right.
This
Yeah.
pub culture that's created that people kind of like we're doing now. How people can just kind of get around, sit and chat, like either with coffee or with a pint of beer or something like that. It's just
Right.
this good like art of communication.
Don't do drugs. Don't drink till you're 21. Just getting that out of the way.
Well, I really like what you were saying about how like it's not always super applicable to everyone, but there are those rare cases. So like I was thinking in England, if you look at like Harry Potter, it's kind of a weird concept. It's like, okay, these kids are going to go to a magic school, right? But everyone loved it.
Especially since in the past there have been like whole cultures that have decided to hunt witches.
Witches, right? Yeah, and of course it only would have been acceptable when it was kind of written, right? And it might not even be that great today, but it's such a staple now. But like, it definitely had English undertones, like they're going to a boarding school. That's something you see a lot back in England, but not a whole lot
they're taking a steam train to get there.
Right, yeah, they take a train to get there. They use, like, the spells are all Latin and stuff, which is, and there's all kinds of, just even the way they talk and the things they say are very, like, distinctly English.
Yeah.
And then one other one that I was thinking of from England would be, like, Pink Floyd, because that was a very weird, like, the record company, like, the label company took a huge risk. Because they were like, these guys are weird. I guess it won't be that big of a risk if they just die out. But everyone loved them, and lots of people know their songs. And one of the quotes from, I think it's Time, off of Dark Side of the Moon is, "Hanging on in quiet desperation is the English way," which I just thought was, like, a funny quote because it's totally accurate of what happened to them at the beginning of the 20th century. If you look at, World War II and all the speeches that Churchill gave while they were, while the Blitz was going on and they were getting bombed day and night, it was basically, we will hang on until we're all dead or until we beat them back. And that was basically what they did. They sent their kids off on trains to go, to the rural parts of the country that weren't going to get bombed, and they sat there waiting every night for the sirens to go off. And if you died that night, you died. And it's totally kind of this depressing, looming, awful idea. But the way that the band presents it is just like, it gripped a lot of people, and that's why it's one of the most famous albums by that band, and I would say out of the 70s and 80s. Well, I guess Dark Side was 69, I think, but anyways, that time period.
A lot of the best songs are like based on like cultural identities and like issues. So unfortunately in Nepal there's not really a lot of modern music based out of there, but you can see it in a lot of the folk songs. It's just like enduring. The mountains are a huge part of their culture and religion, as they're seen as temples of the gods, and their folk music attests to this, and a lot of it's praising the mountains for what they've been gifted, because the area in the south of the country is very fertile land.
Yeah, right.
So they've been blessed with they've got these amazing mountains to the north and this great farmland to the south. And a lot of the culture is also based in stories. So a lot we have fairy tales today to teach you a lesson. They have them. It's a major part of it's within the Hindu religion too, that you teach by way of stories, where there isn't really like a sacred text like the Bible in Hinduism. It's more just you teach by stories and talking to people.
Gotcha. And that kind of even comes back to like what we were saying earlier about, since Nepal is so religiously based, there's not a whole lot of what we would say modern culture is there, because modern culture would clash so furiously with those traditional, especially Hindu values, are very modest.
It's also the geography too. Like, it's really hard to get stuff in there and get stuff out.
Right, so that might be why it's not there. But like, let's say you were to introduce like Fergie to Nepal, wouldn't go over well.
I don't think
so.
So,
kind of,
especially after she sang the national anthem so poorly.
So kind of connecting that to Ireland and connecting Ireland and Nepal, kind of like how in modern Ireland that traditional value is still surviving because it's really easy to spread those ideas, because Ireland is relatively flat. It's an island.
Right.
It's an island. It's relatively flat, and there's not a lot of major boundaries. There's no real forests. Or, I mean, there are mountains to the south, but still, it's really easy to spread those ideas and kind of share cultures. Right. But in Nepal, because of the geography, it's much harder to get that information across to the people.
That's why there's 19 different languages.
Yeah.
Right. And in China, there was a little help from a small, little-known person named Genghis Khan. He kind of united a lot of it and kind of spread one belief system. And
he was Mongolian.
He was Mongolian, yeah, but he took China.
Yeah, so most of that.
Most of Asia.
The East.
Yeah. So, he helped a lot. But, yeah, it's a lot easier to spread through China than it is to spread through Nepal, just because, it's so isolated.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens a little bit in Ireland and more in Norway, where there's like fjords and other ravines and things.
Yeah.
You just
I mean,
can't
until
access.
the invention of the railroad and until that idea got to Norway, some of those villages, or even before boats got there, some of those villages were cut off from the rest of the world. That fjord was the only thing they knew, and going on top of the fjord was like mysterious and terrifying because you didn't know what was beyond there. It was the land. It was for many it was Jotunheim, the land of the gods, and for many cultures that's forbidden to go there.
Well, and also they also have the GDP to do it. Nepal is still kind of coming up, and they only have a GDP of about $21 million, when most of that comes from a 2-month period in the summer where it's just climbing permits.
Right. So it's like shawarma
For comparison,
in the summer is Nepal in the winter.
Yeah, because like
because there's no people coming over.
I get that's a good comparison, I think.
Probably not, but
so we've talked a lot about.
For comparison, for those of you who don't know, the
Okay.
U.S.'s GDP is 18.57 trillion USD.
And China
The United
is
States,
fairly
China
similar.
is 11.2.
And Nepal is 21 million.
21 million.
21 million.
So, like, it's still fairly large, especially for a country.
but comparatively,
But
not,
like
right.
compared to countries like China and America, it's not that big.
Well, it's only 56,827 square miles too.
Right.
Which is all really isolated, considering that, like I said earlier, it goes from 3,000 feet to over 29,000.
So like the majority of that though is just mountains that are uninhabitable.
Yes.
Or just too steep.
Well,
that you
and
can't
a lot of
go
them are forbidden to go on because they're considered religious places.
Right.
Weird.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of places like that in America.
Well, and one other thing about Nepal is the mountains that are considered religious are religious places and therefore forbidden to go on are like dangerous to climb. Like because the first time that people were going up Everest and all the other ones is like these are really difficult mountains to climb, and a lot of the reason that people are able to climb like Everest now, and there's still a bunch of deaths every year. A lot of the reason is because those routes have been mapped, they have been marked. There's like ropes and guidelines, and there's ladders up some of the ice walls, up most of the ice walls, and over
On
ravines.
Everest, but
And,
not really anywhere else.
well, yeah, but like Everest is the most popular climbing one, and still claims
Did you
lots
hear
of
the
lives.
story about the vegan girl who tried to climb Everest and
Yeah,
died
that
on like
was-
the third day?
Jeez.
Yeah,
that's awful.
she went
Hilarious.
she went to go demonstrate that
Vegans are
weak
tough, yeah, and then
and died.
failed.
Wow. Okay.
Eat your meat. That's another big Floyd quote. How could you have your pudding if you don't eat your meat, Cody?
Well, like what he
Wow.
said, it's become very commercialized. And the first person that was credited with climbing Everest, even though everyone thinks that Mallory did it first, he said, you climb mountains because they're there. And it's that human curiosity of wanting to go where no one else has gone before.
Right.
And why Everest has become very commercialized. If you're familiar with the David Sharpinson, this guy made the stupid decision of going up by himself.
Mm.
He paid some shoddy guide company to get him there, and then he climbed it by himself. But he made the decision. Here's the thing with summiting: is you leave at 3 in the morning. You have like a 4-hour window because it's above the death zone where there's not enough oxygen to sustain life.
Yep.
So this guy left at 3 in the afternoon.
What a
Oh,
idiot.
yes.
So then he ended up above the death zone, and this marker called Green Boots Cave. There's this body that's there. It's a long story. And people thought he was dead, and they kept passing him by. And people started getting mad because they realized that, hey, you should have helped him, when in actuality, above 8,000 meters, it's nearly impossible to get someone out, because if you sit down, you're dead.
Nice.
Wow.
So
Fun times.
So, one of the other sources that I looked at was a TED Talk by a man named Pad Davili, and the title of the TED Talk was "Every Conversation Can Change a Life." And I talked a little bit about this earlier about the pub culture in Ireland, how there's really this this joy of conversation,
Right.
and just kind of being there for your friend or whatever that needs to be done. And he tells a story about how he was struggling with his own business, and he was thinking himself a failure to his family, and he was afraid to go home because he didn't have enough money to buy his mom a Christmas present for Christmas, and that's tough. But he had one conversation with another person who was doing the job he wanted to do, but better. And he had that conversation, and it was just that little bit of spark of motivation and it was actually someone from England that got in contact with him and kind of gave him that inspiration to kind of change what he was doing. And he ended up actually starting a fitness workout club on the beach because he literally had nothing else. He couldn't rent a space or an office building or anything like that. He just had like a couple of cones to mark off an area and the beach. And he grew from only 5 clients on the first day to now, when I checked the websites, over 5,000 clients UK-wide.
Well, and what you're talking about is either the chaos theory or the butterfly theory or the snowball theory or theorem or effect or whatever it is. Like, small actions can, like, massively change events entirely. And, like, you see this in U.S. history, you see this in Chinese history, you see this in English history. Something super small. Like, there was a point during the U.S. Civil War when one of our officers was going to betray and, like, give over the fort that became West Point, which, had that meeting gone through, George Washington was actually in that base during the time that it was going to get handed over. And I can get you... Revolutionary War. Wrong war. Right point in my head. Wrong words. Revolutionary War. George Washington would have been captured with the handing over of that base, but he got caught, and it was by a matter of 20 minutes. Something stupidly small changed entirety of world history. And, this happens with China. Confucianism... And Confucius, if he hadn't have had some of his childhood experiences, I don't think he would have done what he did. No. In Nepal, had somebody not figured out that there was a really, really tall mountain there and wanted to go climb it.
Nepal was still developed at that time, but it'd probably be part
right,
of
but it wouldn't be where it is now.
And then in England, think about that small action, when King John signed the Magna Carta, which basically ended a total monarchy for not just England, but really human history.
Right. He was forced, but yeah.
I mean, he was kind of forced to, but still, just that simple act of just writing your name on a paper changed world history.
Right.
And then
because the world's such a complex place, there's things are intertwined so madly nowadays, it takes nothing to completely mess everything up.
I think that's definitely something we've lost, and it looks like we're kind of going to be out of time here soon, but something we've lost, especially in the United States, especially now, is the whole, in Ireland, they've kind of redeveloped the culture of conversation. I think that's something we've lost. Every conversation turns political, it turns into an argument, someone gets upset, someone gets mad, and we need to kind of revive the acceptability of conversation and
that
being
respect.
Able to communicate. Yeah, and the respect for other people, right? So I think that's definitely something we could look for towards the future.
So yeah, that was our discussion for World Literature Roebuck's first hour.
Tune in next week as we discuss the American political system.
Woo!
Yeah.
Okay, on that note, I'm stopping this recording.